Hi, everyone. I am TEDxEmory. I might be the most unlikely entrepreneur that you have ever met. About 14 years ago, my husband and I moved from downtown Atlanta to Clarkston. We were in our 50s, in our early empty nest phase, and we moved to Clarkston, a little suburb of our city that Time magazine has called the most diverse square mile in the country. When you think diversity, don't think American diversity. When you think of Clarkston, think global diversity. That's because there are about 40 countries represented there, and they speak about 60 languages. There are just a few of them there. Perhaps more than any other place on earth, Clarkston sits squarely downstream from the larger refugee crisis. Most of our foreign-born residents moved to Clarkston as refugees fleeing war, persecution, armed conflict, and all kinds of violence. They also, when they first arrive, encounter other crises as well: food, housing, education, and job insecurity. And, of course, they bear the scars of all kinds of trauma. So our move to Clarkston was a bit of a shock to the system, but I would say, more than anything, it was a romance. We fell in love with our refugee neighbors. We loved their heroism, their resilience, and most of all, their hospitality. The first refugee neighbor we met was Elena. As I'm sure you know today, being a refugee comes at a higher price, to be honest and open today. And so Elena asked me not to share her real name or what country she comes from. A friend brought her to our house. We had just moved in, so we sat among our boxes in our living room drinking tea, and Elena told us her refugee story. When she left that night, I basically curled up into a fetal position. I could not handle her story. I couldn't imagine how on earth she could function after witnessing the murder of her husband and all of her children. And I felt this really deep sense of despair, not only over her story, but on my sense of insignificance and helplessness. We had moved to Clarkston to be good neighbors, and yet I couldn't imagine how we could do that. It's kind of embarrassing to admit, but very quickly, on the heels of being frozen, I became fixated on being a fixer. And before I went to bed that night, I dreamed up a dozen ways that I felt like we could help Elena and others like her. I've since learned that both of these reactions are textbook responses to trauma, whether it's your own or someone close to you. The first is a functional freeze. It's an evolutionary survival method that allowed me to play dead, to get stuck in my feelings when I heard Elena's story. And I have since learned, as observing myself probably more than anything, that when people stay frozen, it's all about them. And it was all about me and my feelings, which made me not much good to anybody at the time. The second equally common reaction is aptly named the white knight syndrome. It's arrogance. I thought I could fix everything. I had this manic sense that I could bring my own resources into play. I had an education, I had a network, and I could help. I thought I could fix things. Phew, but I couldn't. The next day, Elena called me, and she said, "Kitti, come to the Department of Labor now, I need you." I neglected to mention that Elena's grandfather in her home country is a tribal king, and so she's basically a princess. And I reacted to her like that. All of my feelings from the night before flew out the window. I was like an insecure middle school girl, and I went, "But Elena, I don't know where the Department of Labor is." And she said, very calmly, "You can Google it, can't you?" And that's when I realized there is no script for this. And if there was, Elena was going to write it. About a year later, I had an idea that wouldn't go away, and it felt viable. But it almost never happened because of these two reactions I've just shared with you. I love coffee. I have ever since I was a teenager. I love the vibe of coffee shops. I loved my new refugee and immigrant friends. I love my old friends. And so I dreamed up this idea that maybe we could have, and I could start, a coffee shop, a nonprofit coffee shop in Clarkston that would bring our worlds together, that could possibly create some jobs for my refugee neighbors and some training for better jobs in the future. And it's very ambitious. I wanted to be able to tell the world what I knew, the better, the more accurate refugee story. I could see it all, down to the chickens that I'd sketched in my journal, because in my mind, we would have a chicken coop, and we would serve eggs from our chicken coop. By the way, that never happened. If you're with the health department, don't worry. The point is, my fixer idealism was boundless until it met my frozen realism. I had been a pastor's wife and a soccer mom for years. I had a very small career in writing. I did not know how to do any of this. I was old enough to know what I didn't know, and it was most things. My husband and I used to laugh and say that if you added our business acumen together, you would get a negative number. It's true. And besides, the global refugee crisis and the local refugee crisis were way too big. It was massive, and my idea was microscopic. And I was microscopic. I just couldn't see it happening. And then I went to a writers' conference, and I met this young man named Mike Rush. Mike is about the age of my oldest son. And maybe it was being in a strange city and talking to someone I didn't know, but I felt emboldened to share my idea with him. I'd only shared it with my husband and a few trusted friends and family, but I told him, and he said those magic words, "This idea isn't small, it's big, but I think you should do it." And then he shared this very simple graph with me, and for the first time, I could see my microscopic self in the huge, massive world. I could see where my infinitesimal dot of real estate was in the world. So I'm going to share this graph with you. I usually share it on a napkin over coffee, but you get a screen. So here we go. Let's use our imagination and pretend that this is the whole world, with all of its pain and all of its beauty. Before I put anything on this napkin, I want to say that the words that I'm going to share are not moral classifications. This is simply a description of what you and I look like in the world and where we are most at home. So, we'll start with this continuum. Most of us are near people or far people, or somewhere in between. Now, by far, I do not mean aloof. I mean you have that wonderful ability to step back and to get perspective. And by near, I don't mean you're an obnoxious close talker. I mean you know how to lean in to people. Most of us are either loud or quiet. And I hope if you see yourself somewhere on that continuum, you are great with where you know you are, because the world needs your volume. So, if you are loud and you're far, you might be an activist. And I'm going to give some examples, and I'm shooting for the moon here. You might be an activist like a John Lewis. If you're far and you're quiet, you might be a supporter, a Melinda Gates. If you're loud and you're near, you might be an implementer, a Mother Teresa. And if you're quiet and you're near, you might be a mentor. Before I move on, I hope you see yourself in one of those quadrants. But I do want to say that I think it's healthy for all of us to visit all the quadrants. And especially if you're young and you're still figuring out who you are, it's really great to try all of it and fail maybe in some of them, because that's how you'll find out who you are and where you fit in the world. But now I'm going to say what has to be the most obvious thing I've said so far. The world isn't flat. You know that. But I believe the way the world rounds out is the presence of real people. People like my friend Elena. Early in our friendship, I took Elena to Dancing Goats Coffee in Decatur, not far from here. She is like an NGO in one person, and so she wears herself out. And I wanted to take her to give her a break. So we sat drinking cappuccinos, sitting on soft leather sofas, and she looked around and said, "Kitti, there will never be anything like this in Clarkston." Now, Elena speaks 9 languages, and not one of them is victim. So I knew she wasn't complaining. I asked her what she meant, and she said, "I don't think anybody believes refugees are worth an investment in a place like this, a place that makes them feel welcomed and warm and safe and even useful to the world." That, my friends, is known as a tipping point. Now, I knew I could not make Refuge Coffee happen. The idea was there. I didn't know how to do it. But I did know that I could take ownership and see to it that it happened. I'm a born implementer. I'm always leaning in a little too close and a little too loud. I adore meandering conversations over coffee with no real agenda. I don't like spreadsheets, but I know a lot of people who do. And so, a year later, we got our 501c3, raised a little bit of money, bought our first coffee truck, hired our first refugee barista, and began our job training program. All because a few of us found our dot on the map, and we asked others to join us. Others like Elena. There she is at our annual 5K. Asking others to join us, I believe, is the important part of this story. Early on, when I was just sharing this idea really tentatively with a few friends, a mentor said to me, "If you really want to do this, you need a number 1 volunteer." And so I went to a friend and a neighbor, and I said, "Hey, to get this idea off the ground, I need a number 1 volunteer. Would you be my number 1 volunteer?" And she said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I have no idea." And she said, "Okay." And we did it. I honestly believe, and I know this isn't everyone's take on it, but the way to address a crisis as big as the world refugee crisis, which, by the way, includes 123 million displaced people today, the best way to address it is not to fix it, not to be frozen by your big feelings about it, but to befriend the people most impacted by it. Today, we have 4 locations in Atlanta. It's been 11 years, so it's been a while. We have 4 locations, soon to be a 5th, not very far from here. We have trained and employed a bunch of really talented refugees and immigrants from over 17 countries, and this number is not super accurate, but we've served around 4 million cups of coffee. We're starting to count now, but we didn't then. So I want to leave you with this, okay? This started all because a few people, we found our dot, and then we let the massive world, faraway world, the hurting, almost dying world, the confusing world come close enough that it looked like humanity. And I would say to you, if this world and the humanness of this world and your own sense of inability to do anything good for the world, if it all feels terrifying to you, you're in good company. I'm terrified almost every day. But if you also feel some false confidence, and I feel that too, don't let any of that stop you. Find your microscopic dot. Find a few more people to join you. And I'm not sure what will happen, but one thing I know for sure, you will find massive amounts of hope. Thank you.